Oh, we're on. Go. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. It's again my pleasure to introduce Akshay and Monica here to talk to you about metrics today. They're both engineers at Xero, both on the same team, and been working really hard on this talk. So, everyone, big round of applause. Thank you.
Is your team working like a well-oiled machine? Is delivering features on time a good enough measure? There's so many things that we could do to try and improve our engineering practices. There are numerous books, talks, and blog posts, all touting to the next best thing that we could do. I've got a question for you. Which one of these practices are good for you? How do you know how these practices will impact your project delivery? How do you know how well you're working as a team? Good morning, everyone. My name is Akshay.
And I'm Monica. And today we're going to go through a talk that's going to get some of the information that we've learned about metrics out of our brains and into yours. So just to set up your expectations, we're going to go through why we started down this journey as a team. We'll talk about how we implemented the first metric that we implemented, which was our deployment lead time. And sort of the pitfalls and the peaks of that will be covered as we retrospectively look back on the process that we've gone through.
So why we went on this journey of integrating metrics into our team? Back in August 2019, a team at Xero Auckland inherited Xero Expenses. This was done as part of an organization transformation. It would help Xero align better in terms of the product it has to offer. Our team grew from 5 engineers to 18 in a matter of months. And we were tasked to deliver features, this legacy code base, which personally I was scared of touching. For me, it was like stacking a house of cards that could fall flat on its face. As a team, we also wanted to measure how our experiments are going. We wanted to improve our engineering practices, but we didn't have any benchmark to measure us against. And as an example, we wanted to implement TDD, but we didn't know what TDD would do to our project delivery. Would it make us go faster? Would it make us go slower? Or would we slow down to go fast?
We were meeting our deadlines, but internally we felt really unsure about how we were doing as a team. We didn't know how our practices stacked up against other teams in other companies, and we were really struggling to reflect on how we could do better. And our stakeholders were lacking visibility. We were telling them that we were struggling, that we didn't really understand the code base that we were working on. But they didn't understand how that was affecting our practices. We had no numbers to show them. It was just all about our feelings. And we wanted more than that. So we started down the path. We were figuring out how to implement these metrics. We'd all read the books, the blog posts, we'd listened to talks. And when we sat down to start implementing, we were confused. We knew that we wanted to implement a tool that would measure our deployment lead time. But as soon as we sat down to start doing that, we realized we didn't know how. So let's talk you through that process. The first thing is that there's a lot of different ways to measure your deployment lead time. And depending on your code base and how you work, any one of these might work for you. We went with average commit to deployment. When we started this process, we had really large batch sizes. This, I think, was a function of the fact that we were really uncomfortable with our code base. And the deployment process was actually really painful and long. Some of our components depended on each other, and so we had to release multiple components in order to just deploy one piece of code. It was painful, it was clunky, and we were a bit fearful about the process. And so we wanted to know how long these pieces of code were sitting in our branch, in our master branch, waiting to go out to production. So by measuring average commit to deploy, we got a little bit of a feeling of sort of the span of time that things were sitting.
So now we knew we wanted to calculate the deployment lead time. We had an idea what it was. And the next thing was to figure out where to put this tool in. We thought, in our perspective, the best place for this tool to live would be in our CI/CD pipeline. We wanted this tool to be agnostic of the component that we use it against. Like Monica suggested, we had a lot of components that we wanted to track. This is how, briefly, the flow would look like. It would get plugged into the CI/CD pipeline, in our case, Team City. The tool would do some calculations that we'll talk to in the talk, and then we have some data output that we'll publish. To effectively make sense of this data, we as a team decided we need at least these 6 properties to deliver perfect metrics. Component name. Component name would be the name of the component that we are deploying. Merge time is the time when your pull request is merged into the main branch. The deploy time is a time when your code is visible in production. We also got Jira issue number and link to PR. We got that for a reason, and hopefully this will be clear as the talk progresses. And eventually, obviously, deployment lead time. Getting the component name was fairly easy. Because this tool was getting plugged into our CI/CD pipeline, we decided to pass it as an input argument. We used yargs.js as a command to pass the arguments to our command line tool. Keep in mind, we wanted a very simple solution. We just wanted to get started. We didn't want anything fancy. So now that we have a component name, we wanted to calculate the merge time. This is sort of how the algorithm would look like on a very high level. We wanted to get the history of all the releases of the repository that we are deploying to production. Once we got the history, we would essentially calculate the diff between the version in prod and the version that we are deploying. It looks super confusing, so let's try to dig in deep and try to make sense of it. To get the history from GitHub, we needed the repo, and let's build our input after that. So we wanted the tool to know what repo to grab the history from, and we passed the GitHub repo as a second argument. Once the tool knew what repo to look for, we would get history of all the releases from that repo, get all the merges that's been done in that repo, calculate the diff between the current version and the previous version, filter out all the commits, and we've got a merge list and Jira number. Keep in mind, we wanted the Jira issue number as well. And I'm emphasizing on this point because it'll be later clear what pitfalls we went into as the tool progressed. This is how the history output will look like. In this example, we are deploying 2.0.217, and the release in production is 2.0.216. This is a happy, happy scenario because we're presenting to you folks. It just has one commit. How lucky. The commit data structure would have the author name, committer, etc. But I want you folks to have a keen eye on the commit message. In this case, the engineer has been amazing, and they have prefixed their commit message by the Jira issue number. The tool did some calculations, and we've got the merge time, the time that PR was merged in your main branch, and the Jira issue number.
Awesome. So once we had the start time, the merge time, we wanted to calculate the deploy time. So for this, we wanted to get the most recent successful deployment from our Team City server and get the time that that deployment finished. We're aware that obviously there's a lot of retries that happen sometimes, especially in the beginning of this process when it was flaky. There might be issues that we found manually testing in UAT, or we might have to roll back for some reason. So we just wanted to make sure that we got the last successful deployment as the end time to get a really sort of more accurate image of what was going on. So in order to do that, we needed a couple more arguments. The first one was the Team City server URL. Of course, it's quite hard to call APIs if you don't have the URL, so that was helpful. And the API also required us to have the Team City build type ID. So that, again, was an argument because it's a per component basis. So here's the code block, roughly. We've cleaned this up slightly. It was a rough and ready code base. So let's look through a couple of the parts of this code block. So here we go. We've got the builds for a particular branch. In this case, a branch is a deployment. So for example, we're talking about 20217. Then if there's more than one build, let's filter out the last successful build so we can just traverse and reverse. And then let's get the prod deployment time. So that's called the finish state in the Team City server API. So we'll grab that. And we get this big output in which we're only interested in one number, right down the bottom there, the finish state.
Like I suggested earlier, apart from these 3 points, we also wanted the pull request URL and the Jira issue URL. And the reason behind that was we wanted to be on top of our deployment lead time. If our deployment lead time was high, we wanted to dig into why why our DLT was high. Pull request URL would allow us to track that commits journey fairly quickly without manually searching it in GitHub. Getting the pull request URL was super easy. If you remember, in step 1, we had GitHub repo as inputs. The tool already knows what GitHub repo to look at. And we also have the merge list for all the commits in that particular repo. So it's essentially just constructing the URL.
Getting the Jira issue URL was slightly more complex, only because we required developers to input the ticket number manually. At the start of this process, it was a bit patchy, but throughout the process, we found so much value in being able to sort of debug what was going on with longer deployment times that this has become really consistent, and I don't remember the last time I didn't see one. So it's something to keep in mind, but I think as you find value in it, people become they do it automatically. And so finally, we have this output here. We've redacted some values, but there's the information that we needed that we were talking about at the beginning. This is really great, but it's not so great to show to our stakeholders. So what do we do next?
So we started with where to put this tool. We knew it's a CI/CD pipeline. We have the data, but what do we do with this, right? We wanted a quick and easy solution. We didn't want to implement anything complicated. We didn't want to dig into the databases. We wanted everyone to have visibility on this. We wanted our product owners, our product managers, even marketing people if they want to have easy access to this data. In order to do so, we decided to RESTfully publish all this data to Google Forms. This is how a form looked like. And again, as we mentioned, it had the component name, the start time, end time, or merge time, deploy time, and Jira issue and pull requests if we could construct it. Let's see how this data would look like in CSV. This is the example that we are tracking. So we've got the release number, 2.0.217. We've got the component name. We've got the merge time and end time. And deployment lead time is essentially subtracting the end time from the start time. Remember how I told you we wanted this tool to be integrated with all our components? Let's see what happens if everything writes to the same CSV. This is still a very good example. Our CSV is massive. In here, we've got another component writing on it, the service component. Again, they've got version number, start time, and end time. We couldn't show this to the stakeholders and be here you go, that's your data. So we, as a team, decided to aggregate this because we wanted them to have a view of how the entire product was doing rather than per component. But at the same time, we as engineers could filter out how each component was doing and keep a close eye on our deployment lead time. Next slide. This is what we showcase to our stakeholders in our sprint reviews. We would tell them This is our mean deployment lead time. We'll tell them how many releases we have done, how many PRs we have, and also the median, because some stakeholders liked to have a variety of numbers. Next slide.
So let's start reflecting. First of all, there are a few pitfalls. The first one was that we were grouping different deployables metrics together. Now, that's really great because it gives you one number, sort of like a heartbeat number. You can track it really easily. But if you're anything like us, different deployables have different ideas of what is a good deployment lead time. For some of our components, especially at the start, it might be in the minutes, whereas others might be in the hours. In fact, some code bases were so flaky that it was normal for stuff to sit there for days. So by grouping these together, every time we went into a sprint review, we were getting these numbers that were just jumping all over the place. It didn't give our stakeholders a good idea of how the processes we were changing were impacting the way that we were deploying. The other thing that we didn't get quite right at the beginning was looking at short timescales. By looking at sprint to sprint, things change all the time. You know, 1 week, everything goes wrong, and the next week, everything's smooth sailing. Nothing about our processes had changed between those two, but it gave this idea and false sense of improvement from week to week, and then it would jump back up again. So it was really difficult to see how any of the changes we were making to our processes were actually impacting our deployment lead time over time. So those are a couple of pitfalls that we'd recommend that you don't fall into if you go through the same process. Now let's talk about some of the peaks.
Remember how I mentioned why we started doing this? We had a new team working on a legacy code base. Adding metrics made us more confident. It's a random statement, right? How do metrics help us be more confident? We added this tool in our pipelines and realized that deployment lead time was through the roof. We started digging into it and then realized that our code was sitting in our UAT environment for ages, and we weren't comfortable deploying it. We were doing so much manual testing. And the reason for that was we had very less test coverage in form of unit tests, component tests, integration tests, what have you. Slowly with time, we started writing tests around the features that we were developing. Not only the features we were developing, we also wrote tests for existing features. We became more confident in delivering features. Our DLT was steadily reducing, and our stakeholders and we were happy. We also knew how we were working as a team. All engineers in the team were very mindful of the deployment lead time. We knew if, for one component, the deployment lead time was high, we wanted to know why it was. We took offense personally if our DLT was high, and that was great to know.
So as I actually said, there was a lot of sort of personal ownership of this number. We really wanted to drive it down, and we started looking for all sorts of different ways that we might impact it through experiments or changes in our process. For example, one big one that we did was making sure that the components that were dependent on each other were no longer dependent on each other. Of course, that was an experiment that reduced the deployment lead time quite dramatically. And as we added those unit tests and component tests and end-to-end tests, we actually got so confident that multiple of our components now go all the way automatically. We merge and it goes to production. So that's had a massive impact on our deployment lead time. And our stakeholders gained the visibility that they wanted. It empowered them to ask questions. If we're in a sprint review and our deployment lead time has gone up, there are questions around how. Why? Why did it happen? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? And without that data, there's no sort of conversation about that, and we're finding it really difficult to get buy-in from all of our stakeholders to really allow us to go on this journey and improve our processes. And now we find that our stakeholders are often the ones driving it. In fact, it's improved visibility so much that other teams in our area are also implementing metrics now. So that's been a really great outcome. So some key takeaways. If there's anything you can do when you leave today, it's get started. Metrics aren't going to do anything for you if you haven't implemented them. So get started today. Well, wow, we are... One moment, please. Wow, exciting, really. Let's hope we're good there. No? Let's try. Hang on.
can just talk through.
1 moment. Can you hold that for me?
Yeah. We'll be back shortly.
So key takeaways. You're going to have to visualize it with me. Let's go through them again. So get started. Metrics don't do anything for you while you're just thinking about implementing them. You know, the time between when we started thinking about implementing them and when we did was a long period. And during that time, we were still just as in the dark as when we thought about implementing them for the first time. Make it simple. Your first iteration doesn't need to solve all your problems. Don't get too hung up about how to implement it, what metric exactly to go with. Just get started. Once you start getting that data through, you'll be able to tweak it. For example, we were going with our average merge time, but our batch size is pretty much 1-to-1 with our deployments now. So we're actually looking at going with the last merge time now, so that's great. And keep it visible. These numbers are something that we presented to our stakeholders once every sprint. But as a team, we were constantly looking at ways to make it more visible for us, to really understand how we were trending on a more day-to-day basis and really be keeping it front of mind in our conversations.
Talking about metrics is a norm these days in the industry, but for us it was quite a journey. We didn't know what to do, we didn't know what the end result was, but we got there. We really hope that today we have given you enough information to incorporate these metrics into your team and empower them to do the best work of their life. Thanks, everyone. Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Any questions? Hands up.
Hey, hi Akshay.
Hi.
So we've been looking at a similar piece of work where I work, and one of my key concerns around this kind of thing is the old adage that any metric becomes a target, right? Where you start to focus on the numbers versus focusing on the actual outcomes, because any metric is kind of an imperfect measure of the outcomes that you're after. Can you talk me through some of the ways that you've kind of mitigated this, or how you've addressed those kind of concerns?
Yeah, certainly. So we have been lucky in the terms of that all our key stakeholders are aware that this is not a target. This is the way the team is working. And if these metrics are high, we have usually a good enough reason, but no one holds us accountable externally that why deployment lead time is higher. So in our case, we've been lucky that no one has used it as a target, but I do see how it can be triggered like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that we're using it more as a method to start a conversation around how things are going and how we could improve them. And like I said, each deployment we have different ideas as a team as to what we think is a good number at the moment. And we don't expect that to fall without work on it. So yeah, definitely a conversation starter rather than a target.
Hi, I just want to double check on my notes. You said before you had large batch sizes because of uncomfortable work. You mean lots of small PRs going into a UAT or lots of big PRs? Like what did you mean by large batch sizes,
Sure.
I guess?
Yep, so it was generally smaller PRs still, but because the actual deployment process felt really uncomfy, it took a long time, there was a lot of manual testing, there was a real tendency to just sort of like leave it and go, oh, well, there's other work coming up later this week that we could deploy at the same time, and that's sort of what I mean by large batch sizes.
What other metrics did you consider, or what other metrics did you find useful, or potentially metrics that you didn't find useful within your team?
In our perspective, for our team, like we said, the deployment lead time was great. We also have some SLOs around this. So we've got like the holistic picture of how our product is performing. In my perspective, I wasn't a big fan of the deployment frequency because it didn't tell me much. I was more concerned with deployment lead time and the other SLOs. But there were other stakeholders who wanted the entire picture.
Yeah, one thing that we're sort of toying with at the moment is including delivery lead time, which is slightly different from deployment lead time in the sense that deployment lead time is from when it's in your actual code base, whereas delivery lead time includes the actual work time, so from when you pick up a task. And we think that that might be an interesting one to have a look at.
So I think Jira tickets and features has different sizes. So do you ever normalize your measurements to accommodate those different like PRs?
I think that in our case, because we were looking at the deployment lead time rather than the delivery lead time, we were just looking more at how long it was sitting in our code base until it went out to production. And so the size of the task itself wasn't impacting that number for us. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Akshay. Thank you, Monica. Certainly a lot there that a lot of people can learn from, and well done on getting through the technical difficulties. So we.